Today is September 9th, 2014. My name is Teresa Larson, and I'm talking with Terry Lee Lowman. Terry, do I have your permission to record your picture and your voice today?
Yes, you do.
Thank you very much. We want to talk today about your family's contribution to the business community in Ames, but my first question is, when and where were you born?
I was born in Mary Greeley, the old wing that's now got a new building over its old footprint, in May 17th, 1947.
So you went to several grade schools in Ames. Tell me the grade schools that you attended.
Okay, well, we lived on South Riverside, and I walked the 3 blocks to school. And I didn't like my 2nd grade teacher. What happened in 1st grade, though, was we went out to playground, and nobody said I couldn't leave, and so I went home. Literally, nobody said anything, so I went home. My parents are like, "You can't be here, you have to go back to school." Nobody told me I couldn't leave. I thought it was a free person. They always talked, when we were kids after World War II, there was a lot of talk, you know, it's a free country, you can do what you want. So I took advantage of that for a few minutes. And then in 3rd grade, we moved to Marston Avenue, and I went to Roosevelt, and that's where I finished my grade school. Mm-hmm. We moved 2 years later to Wisconsin Avenue, and I just rode my bike from Wisconsin Avenue to Roosevelt School.
That's a long ways.
It's a fairly long ways, but Mom and Dad wanted me there because I had a paper out on Main Street, and this way I could go be where they were right after school. And then my brother rode it home.
I think you had a good plan.
Yeah, we had a plan. Well, the reason my brother rode it home is he delivered photographs. We worked for Elko photo processing in Kansas City, and the processor would send them to Des Moines, and the newspaper delivery truck brought them to the office. And then we would take them around and pick up the ones and send them back. We dropped them off at the Greyhound bus station to go to Kansas City, so there's a little route there. And Dad did several things like that. We delivered dry ice to the animal disease lab because they shipped it up with the newspaper truck. And then the other delivery thing we did was taking the papers, what we called North, to Ellsworth and Jewel, Hubbard, Zering, Randall, Story City, Roland.
Now, this is all because that your father was with the Des Moines Register and Tribune. He was the agency head,
right,
for distribution here in Ames.
In Ames, but they needed somebody to take the papers to the little towns, to the paper boys that were in these little towns. And we also took the Ames papers with us, and then we also would go around and pick up, usually, I'm only remembering auto parts. We'd go to Arnold Motor Supply, and I really don't remember where else. There were some other places, and pick up tailpipes or something that they needed, and put them in the car and take them to the places in the little towns north.
This is very interesting to me. In a sense, your dad, in addition to having the particular job with newspaper delivery, was using his distribution system almost like a local FedEx.
Yep, it was. You know, and Dad was pretty creative in making money and making deals work. Probably his biggest thing he ever did, he had 5 sales of houses, because he sold real estate, starting in '63. He had 5 houses that were linked together, and all 5 of the houses were contingent on this other person selling their house. You know, so if one of the deals fell through, all 5 of them would have, but it went through, and he probably would have figured out how to buy the last house himself and then resell it later just to make sure the other things happened. The other thing he did was, it used to be that loans were assumable, and in the 50s and early 60s, the loan rates, interest rates were 4.5%, 5.5%. So he would loan them the money. Then these were people who probably didn't have the credit or the down payment. He would loan them the difference between what the mortgage was and the sales price, and do it at current interest. So he was charging 7%, but he got 7% on the 4.5%. So the bank might have $20,000 invested in it, and he's getting 2.5% for the bank's money.
So just review, your dad had the agency starting, I think, 1946 or something?
46, right.
And he did have a variety of jobs up until 1963 when he started his real estate.
He did all sorts of things. He, when we built the house, we realized, built the house in 1955 on Marston, they found they didn't have anybody to install ceramic, and they didn't have anybody to install the Formica, not locally. You know, it was still, Formica was pretty new. They'd used linoleum up before that and a few other things, but nothing like Formica because it held up pretty well. And so he started installing that for Hunsikers and well, H&F, Hunsiker and Furman. And Mom more and more took over the duties of the newspaper, which seemed like a very normal thing to me. But then when Mom passed away, David Dixon was her attorney for her estate, and he said, "Oh, I'd be honored to do that. You know, your mom was the first woman I knew that actually worked out of the house and had a regular job as opposed to, you know, teachers or secretaries. I mean, those were girl jobs, and she didn't do that. She did the other.
She ran a business.
She ran the business.
Yes.
My father helped her. When she got into situations that required a little muscle or something, Dad would step in. But by and large, she took care of it."
Well, let's talk about running that agency and what that must have been like in terms of the hours that it required and the management skill that it required. What would a typical day have been like for either your dad or your mom, whoever was in charge at the time?
Okay, well, the papers would come from Des Moines about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we would distribute them to the newspaper carriers, which wasn't the way it was done when my father took over. They would have the boys come in at 5 in the morning and get their papers. But the advantage of that is you'd know that the papers were picked up and probably would get delivered, but the disadvantage is that as Ames got bigger, it got more difficult for kids to come in. When they started, Ames really didn't go north of 13th Street, or barely. I think Murray Drive was a early kind of an outlier area, but for the most part it was up to 13th Street, and we slowly expanded. Well, if it's only up to 13th Street, 6 or 7 blocks is not going to kill a kid to go into the office. But you know, when we got up to 24th and everything, that was a couple miles, and adding that to their chores was really a lot. And then we would get papers around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, usually around noon, for the afternoon carriers. So we had a morning commitment and afternoon commitment. In the beginning, my father would distribute the papers at 3 in the morning. Eventually, we would hire people to do it. And then when I got to high school, my brother did it. And then when I got my driver's license, I started doing it. And it works well. In the meantime, what I've learned is that indigenous people tend to have a couple of hours in the middle of the night where they get up. So it may not have been as freaky as it felt like it was back then, because as a kid you could sleep through the night, but as an adult, getting up for maybe 2 hours in the middle of the night and doing something really works. It's okay, yeah.
Do you have any idea, 1946, when your dad took over the agency, roughly what circulation was for the newspapers? Can you give me a ballpark?
I can ballpark it because I know that in the end they had about 3,200 registered customers. The evening paper, I would have been the Tribune. I would have had to be a little more vague on, because its circulation actually kind of just stayed steady. It never really moved. So I'd guess maybe 500 Tribunes and maybe around 1,500 registered customers. And it was over double that when they retired from it.
And so when your father started in 1946, how many maybe newspaper carriers do you think it required to distribute?
Oh, probably about 40 to 50. The west side, I ended up with...
When you took over,
When I took over the other side of Ames, I have 41 morning routes and about 12 or 13 evening routes. And I would think that when they started, it would have been somewhat comparable to that.
Okay. let's talk about being a newspaper carrier.
Yeah,
This
okay.
is a concept. People watching and listening to this, the idea of a newspaper carrier may be eventually a concept that we need to explain to people.
Well, I'm sure we will. It's almost out the door already. The Ames paper does have evening, kids that
Delivers.
carry, but the register's gone exclusively to adults. We had kids, and they were usually they were not supposed to start before they were 10. I started when I was 7, but that's
We can talk about that later.
yeah.
Okay.
So they would be 10, and they would carry an evening route for a couple of years. And then when they got to middle school, they'd have football and sports and activities. So then they would graduate to doing a morning route. And typically routes were about the size where the kids needed to get up a few minutes before 6 in the morning and deliver their papers. Usually they weren't over an hour, and they could be a lot less if you really
If you're speedy.
got the lead out and moved. And you could do that, but I mean, as long as you didn't have any major appointments, you could just go ahead and walk along.
When you took over, I'm not sure what year you took over for your father on the west side.
No, I took over. My brother had the west side
So you had
for
the
a
west
while,
side.
and I took over in 1971.
Okay.
The end of May.
But before that, the kids were actually collecting the money from their customers.
They did all the way through the 80s.
Through the
and
80s,
I
okay.
really, we were out of it after that, so I really don't know. And it started out, we would collect every week, and we decided as agency managers that we thought every other week was probably often enough to do this. And there were some old people who had big issues, and my supervisor came up and we had to go to the door and talk to these people and make arrangements so that they could still pay their 95 cents every week, It's the way they had it budgeted, and older people, it must be much harder for older people now than it was when we were kids, because although things changed, they weren't changing that rapidly. I mean, we added a picture to radio, and that was the big deal. We had TV, and now things just, it changes really, really rapidly. And part of it has to do with the corporate America, because corporations kind of have monopolies and they can do what they want to do. So that product you've been buying for the last 30 years suddenly is no longer available.
Tell me what it was like for the young man, because I think it was only men, these late grade schoolers and early middle schoolers, to go collecting. How did that work for them?
Well, you knocked on the door and you'd say, collect, and they would go and get their money. It was not a very speedy process for me because, as you might notice, I'm a little chatty, and I have people that would invite me in and we would sit and talk for a while, and it didn't happen real fast. But you collect all the money, and then when I started, the kids would come in and count their money, and it literally, I had a headache every time they did this, because that the kids would come down and two of them would slap their money out at the same time, and it would roll into each other, and you don't want it to be, you don't want to cheat this little kid, so and they would get in arguments over this and that, and finally I asked people to give the cash to their parents and have their parents write a check so it would be trackable, for one thing. And the parents were very upset that I would ask them to do this. And thinking back on it, I think getting $40 or $50 in cash, it might be like getting $150 now or something like that. But I don't think it would be that big of an inconvenience for the parents to get the cash and write a check. But some of them didn't want to do it. So then if they didn't want to do that, they had to come in on Thursday night. Otherwise, they came in on Friday night to pay. And the only problem I ever had, I had one kid who swore he paid. And I went through all the records, and this particular paper route, he always had a check or two or three, and there were no checks. And I said, I don't recall his coming in, and I don't believe it. And the money showed up anonymously, but it showed up. And
So you had a good track record with your newspaper carriers.
Oh yeah, yeah. The kids were very, very responsible and honest and trustworthy. The parents not so much. I had one parent who got their kids to go follow another newspaper carrier and pick up a whole floor of, it was the university tower. They'd take a whole floor, so it'd look like, oh, they just forgot to deliver this floor. And the issue is that this was like Michelle Cody, I think, and she would get 43 papers, and she'd have 43 customers, and she'd leave with 43 papers and count them and come home without any papers. Once maybe something you could screw something up, but when this is happening Sunday after Sunday, so that they kind of hung out after they delivered the papers, and here was this family across the street, their neighbors, was going and picking these papers up, and they were taking them to Quick Trip and selling them at a discount to Quick Trip. But this was somebody who for years, the mother, she'd go, well, they were short a paper on Tuesday, they were short 2 on Saturday, and they were minus 3 Sunday papers. And she would always adjust the bill, and you'd let her do it. But of course, in the end, I realized it was all, she just was nickel and diming.
Yeah. How did you recruit newspaper carriers? How did your dad recruit newspaper carriers?
Well, secretly, the school system would give us names. They didn't want to be responsible for giving us names, but they would. And I see no problem with it because this helped build the kids up, and it wasn't bad.
What were you looking for in a good newspaper carrier?
Oh, somebody bright-eyed and energetic. And when my father started, he didn't want kids of broken homes because those were not as reliable of kids. Of course, by the time we got done, there was nothing but broken homes, so you took what you could get. And the fact that nobody came from that kind of environment, or very few. I have one friend from high school or grade school or whatever that was from a broken home, and when it's only one, it makes them kind of odd, but when half the kids come from homes that are blended or whatever, their self-esteem was intact, and I think they were too. We would ask the kids if they knew somebody. Sometimes kids would substitute for their friends, and then they would get a route later. And then we would start them with the evening paper in grade school, and when they were 10, and then graduate them to the morning route later on.
So they had to be good at math too.
Yeah, I have one child that I think couldn't read, and I didn't. After working with him for a while, I finally got to the point where I realized I think this is a problem. So if I would call him and tell him what they were, things got done. Maybe he was dyslexic, I don't know. But
Interesting.
But giving him a note wasn't going to work, and that's how we communicated. We had these little blue notes, and we would write that usually it was start or stop. They want to start the paper or stop it, but they might have a complaint, their paper was lost yesterday, would you please be sure it's in the door or whatever. You'd leave him a note. None of that would ever compute with him. And he was a nice enough kid, so it wasn't that he was being ornery or whatever. It was just I don't think he could read. I had one of my employees at the restaurant that in the end I decided he couldn't read.
It is sort of a silent affliction, so to speak.
You'd never share it.
Yeah, you'd never share it, exactly.
It'd be very humiliating.
Yes.
Especially as a college student.
Right.
I don't know how he got through, but...
Well, to return to the newspaper carriers, it sounds as if you'd never had difficulty recruiting them. There must have been...
Oh, yes. We had issues from time to time.
Oh, you did?
We were known to deliver a few paper routes ourselves. And it always seemed like a negative when you found out you got the job. But I have one in the mobile home courts on the west side of town. And looking back on it, I really did enjoy getting out there and delivering them. It's not a bad job. And for people who would jog or whatever, why not?
And what benefits and again, this is still just young men mostly, girls later be able to carry newspapers. But if you were trying to convince a parent that a child could be a newspaper carrier, what were the things that you would say that would be good for them to do?
Well, the negative for the parents is that they had to locate people to cover them when they would go away. Leaving at the last minute could be uncomfortable or whatever. But it taught an awful lot of really great things to the kids. They were independent little business people who promoted their business by they would get free papers to deliver for samples, and then they go back and ask people to start. And we had prizes for that. They could get money or they could get prizes, flashlights and camping gear and things like that, things that kids would want. And they would do the collection, so they had to be good at math and everything. It also taught them the responsibility. I had one carrier whose dad was ready to beat up the customer because they tried to cheat their son out of like a couple months of whatever. But what we tell kids is you don't keep delivering. If they don't pay the bill, you can't keep going. So
they learned about sanctions.
You do, and not to be mean, but you've got to collect it and get the money in. They had to order the papers, so they had to do an accurate count of how many customers they had, because having too many papers meant that you weren't making as much. They got to keep about 25% of what they collected. So for every extra paper you bought, you were losing the work of three customers that were paying. So that didn't work very well. They also learned that life isn't always that easy or that pleasant. I mean, probably the hardest thing for me was dealing with our weather. I grew up to detest our weather because the worse it got, the more we had to be out there and working with this, and the harder and harder it became. On April 9th, 1973, I think it was, when we had that horrible blizzard. Okay, well, I got my papers out, and Dad's employee was having difficulty getting it out. And I couldn't use my car because it was a Ford, and it would not go in just a little bit of snow. And Dad had a Buick, so we took that. We got stuck on Northwood or one of the streets, and there was a drift that was about 6 feet high. We got a foot of snow, and almost no territory was covered with snow, but where there was snow, it was really deep in drifts. It was a huge winds along with it. And when the car got stuck, the other employee was with me, and he walked home. It was just a few blocks to his home. And the neighbor came out and knocked on the window, and she said, "I don't think you're going anywhere. Why don't you come in?" And so I did, and these people were lifelong friends of mine. I stayed a day with them because you couldn't get anywhere. You couldn't move, and I didn't want to leave the car in the middle of the street. I blew the transmission on Dad's new Buick, but it was under warranty, fortunately.
So let's talk about you being a newspaper carrier. We've talked a little bit about managing an agency. You said you started when you were 8.
Actually, I started selling papers on the corner when I was 5. After kindergarten, Mom and Dad would give me a stack of papers and, go do this, because I'm sure I was a pain in the office. We didn't have Game Boys or anything. I don't know what we did, but we did something. So I would go sell the papers on Main Street, and I was just 5, but I'm pretty sure I knew how to handle money.
You can count when
Could
you're 5.
Be wrong, yeah. And then at 7, I got the paper route in my neighborhood, which was South Riverside and South Russell. I might have done Hazel. I can't really remember that. But that was 1954, so I was just 7. And then we moved in 1955, so I had to give up that paper route, and I got Main Street, which didn't involve delivering Sunday papers. The morning carrier took care of it, and the customers, they were mainly the people who lived above the stores and everything.
And now, were you delivering an afternoon paper to Main Street?
Yes.
You were delivering an afternoon paper.
And then in 1959, we moved to where it was where the mall is. Let me see if I can tell you what it is, because it used to be Hunsaker's office was where our house is.
It'd be like 24th and...
24th and Grand.
Yeah.
But the address would have been like, what, 727 or something. There's a cedar tree and there's a rock there, and that was our front yard.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started delivering morning papers, and I was in 7th grade then. And I'm not really a morning person, to be honest with you. I still am not. I'd rather, once I get going, I can keep going, but I don't like to get up that much.
Was there anything odd or funny that happened to you as a newspaper carrier?
Oh, I'm sure there were lots of things that happened. I think the interesting part is how many friends I made, and some of these people, the McVeighs that lived on Hunsiker Avenue, I knew her until she passed away. She had MS, and so she died fairly young. And I delivered Ted Tedesco. I mean, I was their paper boy, and and I knew who these people were for the rest, and I think they kind of knew who I was too.
You had an early network. An
early network. As far as funny things that happened, well, I can tell you something I did that I shouldn't have done. I had a friend with me, and these people had rabbits, and we decided we would like one. So we took one of their domestic rabbits, and then there was a reward for it, and so we gave it back, and I think we got 50 cents for it or something, which is just horrible, but I would never do that again. I think the only reason I would have taken the money is because I didn't want to explain that I was the one that made off with their rabbit.
Oh, well, is there anything else you'd like to say about newspapers? I'm going to move on to another venue here.
I think that covers it pretty nicely.
I guess I have one other question. We've
Sure.
been talking about carrying newspapers. You got to be in the business, really kind of in the golden age of newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And what came along, what are the forces that changed that business model, the business of people actually carrying newspapers to a house?
Well, we talked about Johnny Gosh before, and he got kidnapped, and the newspaper and the radio and the TV stations couldn't seem to leave this story alone. It was very compelling, and I think they could have done a better job of explaining that yes, there are some hazards with it, but there are hazards with just getting up and getting out of bed in the morning, and it is part of it.
So did you find that it was harder to recruit young people after those news stories about the kidnappings?
That was pretty much when I was coming to the end of it.
Uh-huh.
I think obviously it did change quite a bit. But I would get a group of paper boys to go out to recruit new customers, and this was really an important thing in the end of August, 1st September, because Ames's population would change so much.
Kind of place.
My circulation for the Morning Register would go from around 2,000 to 2,800, and it could do that in 2 days, literally. I mean, particularly after Christmas break, because
Right.
people would have starts. And so that there were things that I put together. I would drive my mom crazy because she had a way of doing everything that was, she had about a 10-step process to get a customer started, and I couldn't do that with 800 new customers. It would take 3 days to write all these people into the files and everything. So I found ways to do it that were much more efficient, but she didn't like that. She would stay there till 8 o'clock at night and have a horrible headache because she had to do this before she went home. Where was I going with that? I was talking about promoting, and
Yes.
we would take 3 or 4 kids out and knock on doors to get new customers. And I warned them, you don't go in the house, you stay where I can see you. I mean, there are common sense things you can do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And of course, we had the internet that came along too, that just not only extinguished paper carriers, but practically
The need for paper.
papers. Yeah, the need for paper.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to something else. You and your partner, Mark Cassis, had an establishment in town that was well known for many, many years, Luca's Restaurant. When did you decide to open a restaurant?
Well, it had a lot to do with my coming out as a gay man, because I realized that the business I was in, I'm not a private enough person that I figured I could keep that a secret forever. And if it were a secret, I think the parents would flip out about it. It would need disclosure, and what have you. And so, pardon me, I really looked to get out of the newspaper business just for that reason. I didn't feel I could continue, and I liked the work. I liked the kids. It was a good job, and it paid pretty well back then. But so I met Mark at 10 minutes after midnight at City Disco in Des Moines, January 1, 1977. And he was wearing a white jumpsuit and platforms. He's self-conscious about his height. So he had, and I had platforms too, though. Everybody had them. When I got mine, I went to Safeway, which was down here in Lincoln Center, and I went in the grocery store to walk because I couldn't hardly walk in things. I don't know how women do it, but it's really tough, I think. So we met and we corresponded, which he was going to UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I credit that for how we really found each other, because a physical relationship when you're face to face can take you places that it shouldn't go. And because we had to talk on the phone and had to write letters, we got to know the other person. And Mark Zoll's really super duper, and he's somebody that I couldn't have picked anybody.
Good match for you.
It's a good match for me. Some days it's more drama than I want, but it's okay. If I didn't have it, I'd probably make it happen. You know how people are. So
you met Mark, and you realized that your life needed to be fulfilled in some way. You needed employment. So how did this restaurant come about? Well,
I hired somebody to manage the newspaper and went to Las Vegas, and we were going to try to start a business there. And we worked at it, but it just didn't quite fit together. And so we came back here because we had contacts and we were able to borrow money and do things. It wasn't easy. We put together 4 or 5 pro formas and went to every bank in town and got turned down again and again and again. Finally we borrowed the money, and we didn't borrow enough, and we spent too much, and we were in up to our eyeballs. And actually, Thiel, the man who had Lincoln Way Cafe, Howard,
yes,
nominated us for Businessman of the Year, and we won, mainly because we survived. We had part of our loan at 22% interest, $50,000. I know, it was just awful. And this was because we were becoming a bad credit risk. And we got my dad to buy our duplex, and we paid off the $50,000, and that left us with $110,000 or something that we had to pay. But that was $4,000 a month, which was a lot. I looked at it in later years. I'm not sure what we would have done if we'd owned that much. We probably would have had to work harder or something. But we came back here and figured it out. And our landlord was Harold Schnormeyer. And he kind of coaxed us along, and he was the sweetest, kindest man ever. You know, we had one landlord, we swore we'd never have another one because we could never do as well as we did. You know, in the end, we paid all our rent and everything, but it took us a while to get caught up, like 2 years. We had lots of merchants that we owed money, and
now, when did you start? Remind me.
It was 79. We started doing the construction in 78. We opened a yogurt shop to begin with in Campus Plaza, Humphrey Yogurt. And the one thing you don't want to be in business that we learned, our lesson there was don't be ahead of the curve. People would buy yogurt now, but back in 1978, they weren't buying too much. We had some good customers, but and then avoid something that's so seasonal, because you can't make that much money in 3 or 4 months out of the year. It's just really hard.
How did you pick the Italian theme?
Mark had worked for Johnny Campiano, and he gave us some pointers, but he came into Lucalan's and he said, I'd cover up all these windows. You need to control the atmosphere. And we said, no, I think I like the windows. So we kept them, even though covering them up would have been a really good energy thing because they were awful windows. We eventually got them replaced like 25 years after we were there, but they were leaky. And when we got them replaced, one of the furnaces, the furnace that was in the building when we were there for the banquet room, would not stay lit. The pilot light wouldn't, because the hood was sucking so much air, and before it could pull it from through the windows, but then when the windows were sealed, it couldn't pull it. And it's a poured concrete building, so it didn't tend to be very porous like older frame buildings or even brick buildings where the mortar leaks out.
But you had loyal customers.
A lot of them, and that was the part that really is satisfying, particularly after a busy time. We got used to the flow of Ames, and that's why we built a restaurant in West Des Moines, because we figured we wouldn't have these ups and downs. In Ames, we could have a Saturday where we would do 500 customers, and the next Monday we'd do 2 tables. And, you know, that really is putting the brakes on. But we learned you pare down your menu for special events like that, and you have the food so that you can get it out quickly. And like after graduations, I would stand there and people were so amazed that we could serve that many people in such a short period of time. But we would make large pans of lasagna, chicken parmesan. We would have the chicken breasts already fried and ready to sauce and bake, which just take 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
They go in a 550 degree oven. They're ready to come out pretty quickly. All you wanted to do is melt the cheese, and the sauce was hot and the chicken breast was hot. So
I'm going to ask you this. I've not prepared you for this question, but what did being a newspaper carrier do to help you manage a restaurant? Is there any tie there?
Being in business, I think I mentioned you could actually do the garbage business if you're a good business person. Going from that to that, just because there are a lot of things in how you hire and how you manage your help, how you do your bookwork, how you collect your money. All those things are very relevant.
Transferable.
And in the beginning, I had done bookwork and everything, and Mark said, I want to do that. And I tend to have systems, and I sold business forms for a year and a half, so I had a good idea of how businesses put their paperwork together. And Mark had a sheet for every day, but they were just floating around. We couldn't really figure out what the heck we'd done the first 3 months. I mean, it was just boxes of papers that had no dates or anything on them. And so I learned you put a day's business on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You take the whole month and you staple it together very thoroughly, sometimes going from both sides just to make sure they won't come undone. And that way you had a book for every month, and you could follow 12 books a year, but you weren't going to follow 365 sheets of paper with things stapled to them.
Exactly.
and all that. And so I ended up taking over the office. And Mark really likes innovative, creative things. And gets bored really quickly if it's not innovative and creative. And I can do the same thing. I went in there, I started doing the bookwork in late '79, and I did it all the way through 2013, and it was okay for me. It didn't bother me. Every day is different because there are different dynamics with the people and the customers and the food coming in. I mean, there are lots of dynamic things, but it looks a lot similar day after day.
I thought you might say that in the newspaper business you learned to work odd hours, and restaurants. That's part of it too.
And a lot of hours in the restaurant when we were really busy. We would go in at 8, 9 in the morning, and we wouldn't get out of there till 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Not very many days once we really got things under control. But in the beginning, we had to work like that. And I remember the first month, we lost money the first 11 months, at least on paper, because you'd have depreciation, and that would be pretty heavy in the beginning. But in May of 1980, I don't know, we made $5,000 or $10,000 that month. I burst into tears. I didn't think we were ever going to make it, and that just proved to me we could. And when we opened the other restaurants, we had things under control enough that we made money from day one.
Right.
We knew what we were doing. But
Because you opened up this topic, I'm going to ask you, when you met Mark, you had a venue where you could go and you met him.
Mm-hmm.
But in that time period, this is before the gay and lesbian community, I use the phrase found voice.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they're kind of invisible. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't find voice. Where did people in Ames find companions? Where did they find places to socialize? Where were safe places to gather?
Well, in the 70s, things started to develop a little bit. Dugan's Deli was known to be gay-friendly. Our church hosted the gays and lesbians of Ames, GLA, Gay and Lesbians of Ames. And the backstory on that, I would tell people, if they only knew what's going on here, well, it turned out they did know. Let's see, I got to think, Roy Warman was in psychology at the university, and he said, we have to provide a place. And one time we didn't leave things very nicely, I guess. And when I say we, it wasn't me, because by that time I was partnered up and we weren't staying all night for the parties. But he said, just zip your mouth, we'll take care of it. Somebody put a hole in the wall or something. And they fixed it, and they never said anything because they felt it was really important that...
And where was this location again? I'm sorry?
The
Unitarian Fellowship?
Universalist Fellowship at
Yes.
1015 North Highland,
Right.
a funny-looking building.
And this was in roughly what year?
Oh, this would have been the mid to late 70s.
Mm-hmm. So there must have been a way for people of that community to communicate with one another and let them know that there's a safe place to gather. There's a place where you can feel like you can have compatriots.
I think that what would happen more than anything is it was done through personal relationships, and somebody would meet someone, and when they realized it was safe, they might be introduced to the rest of the community.
Right.
I'm sure this is the way it goes on in small towns now, just places that aren't as safe.
And you said that you really had to make a big life decision. I mean, and it affected, of course, your employment.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel, running Luca that you had negative repercussions if people knew that you and your partner were gay?
Well, the first manager we hired told everybody that we were gay, all applicants. So you have 150 people, he told we were gay. So the word was out there. Yeah, we know it had negative consequences because the Evangelical Free Church, I don't know if it was an official church boycott, but we kept hearing that this group or that group couldn't come to our restaurant because so-and-so went to E-Free and they wouldn't set foot in the place. So, yeah, it affected things. I gave up one other thing, too, though, when I came out, and that was my ex-wife and my 2 children. And I was really scared because at that point you had no protections, and if my ex-wife had decided that she didn't like me, I would never see my kids again. And I was really distraught, and David Wealth was at the university, and I called him up in tears, and he said, oh, you just keep doing the right thing, it won't be a problem, because raising children is a really hard task, and if you're the person you should be, you will have no problem with that. And it was good. It was good advice. It wouldn't necessarily fit for all relationships, but my ex-wife's a really neat woman and everything. I think I told you the story, didn't I, about Mrs. I'm going to forget it. Ruth. She was my substitute teacher. I know I mentioned this. She was a substitute teacher who ended up staying for like 7 months of the school year, and I stayed friends with her forever. And she'd come over and met my kids and my ex-wife and everything. And when we separated, she said, Sylvia was so nice. How, what went wrong? And I said, well, I'm gay. And she goes, oh, well, that makes sense. So, all right.
So you feel she had analyzed you, or she picked
No,
up signals?
no, it's just if you're going to ask me an honest question, what do I have to lose at this point?
Yeah.
You know, and we were friends. I guess I felt comfortable with her,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there are people you do. And she told me stories. Her brother was a pharmacist in Minneapolis, and she said they have to deal with a lot of gay people there. And she was familiar with that part of his business. I had something happen yesterday that was kind of interesting. A classmate of mine called me up and said, I'm staying with another classmate, and her neighbor boy came over and came out, and he was in tears, and he's scared, and his family is not supportive. And she said, what can we do to get him support? And it's like, you know, no one has ever really asked me for that here. So I called up a friend who's a teacher, a retired teacher from Ames High. She taught Spanish. And I have always been very aware that your foreign language teachers are the best allies, as just generally speaking, for the LGBT community, because they're multiculturally comfortable, and so they can make that transition to understanding LGBT issues. And she got on the phone and called the person she thought would be appropriate, and turns out the kid and the teacher know each other already, and he's in his class, and I think it was a comfortable fit. But it was important to me to find the right person, because just telling them to go to the counselor, you don't know. There are people who get into counseling because of their love of Jesus and their hate of homosexuals, and it could end up really, really ugly. So I wanted to be sure we had him in the right place.
It sounds to me, I already know you're an official leader on some
Social
levels,
justice,
in social
yeah.
justice. But I'm guessing that probably you and Mark were mentors, maybe to people you know and people you didn't know. I'm sure there are people who've probably thanked you for being public about who you are.
I mentioned the one kid that came in and dropped off an envelope, who said he would have killed himself if it hadn't been for Luca, and knowing that we were successful on some level, he knew he could have a life, and and he said I would have killed myself. But you get affirmations in really strange ways. I always tried to be as equal opportunity as we could be. I probably hired 90% of the African Americans who came through the door just because I knew that it was going to be harder for them. And I have one that I really liked, a really, really bright young man, a photographer, and was going to Iowa State, and he was late way too many times. And finally I said, Jan, if you don't get it together, I can't keep you. And he showed up late, and I let him go. And he came back later and said, thank you for doing that.
He learned there were consequences.
He needed to be called on it.
Yeah. I always ask this final question. Is there anything else you'd like to say about being in the business community or your social justice community that you'd like to add to this conversation?
Interestingly, we didn't feel that integrated to the business community. Unfortunately, chambers of commerce tend to be maybe a little too closely affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and they had come in to sell me a membership, and I basically told them, and I listened to what they had to say, and what they had to say was, we need to oppress these employees, we can't pay them, and da-da-da-da, and I always felt good when we raised minimum wage, because I knew my competitors had to do it too. And as long as it's a fair distribution, I should be able to make it work. Especially if I'm such a genius, I should be able to make it work. And so I was always happy for that. And I just really didn't like trying to beat people down. And But we had our good friends in the community too. Everett's and us had a relationship over the years. They would get some food and we would get some flowers. And we needed flowers to put on tables and to put on the hostess stand and for parties and things. And they would provide those. Usually they would, the idea was that we would take things they couldn't sell. And things they couldn't sell are often at their most beautiful. They're not going to last very long, but they're at their peak. So we would get them, and that worked out. I just picked up some flowers for a church event from them, and I realized I do try to be good on the arrangement. I grow okra, and I like okra, but if it gets too big, I can't. It's woody, and now I'm growing red okra in the garden, and it's really very pretty. So, but it tends to get woody very fast. So I have plenty of okra for them, and it's very pretty in arrangements. I don't know if you know what it looks like, but
I can picture it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with me today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure for me.
Thank you so much, Terry.
You're welcome.